Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. Now we're going to continue our discussion of WK Interface Controller with a discussion of segues. So everything we've done so far has been pushing or presenting modally without segues. Now we're going to see how to use segues with a couple of methods that will help us do so. Segues are created in Interface Builder with control drag in the very same way as we do it in iPhone or iPad development. So we select the control. In this case, in WatchKit, it is usually a button that fires the segue. And we select that control, and then we control drag from that into a new Interface Builder scene. And that scene is going to be a WK Interface Controller object. All push and modal segues have to have an identifier that we set in the attributes inspector for the segue. We use the context for segue with identifier. This is singular context. That becomes important here in just a moment. But context for segue with the identifier. And we pass the string identifier that we set up in the attributes inspector in Interface Builder for that push or modal segue. And we return an any object. What happens is that when the segue is fired, the context for segue with identifier method will be called. Whatever any object optional we return will be the context that is passed to the new controller. We don't have to pass it. This method and the segue itself passes it to the controller. All we need to do is return this any object optional from the context for segue with identifier method. So in segueing to a single controller, the first step is to control drag from a button on the first controller to the destination controller, and we select either push for navigation or modal for modal presentation. We give that segue an identifier in its property inspector settings. In the first controller's code, we override the context for segue with identifier method. Now, this method can handle multiple segues in the same way as the corresponding method in iOS, iPhone, or iPad development for segues handles multiple segues. All we need to do is check the identifier for each segue and return the appropriate context object from the method. We need to return this as an any object optional. We cannot return it, let's say, as a string. Well, for one thing, it won't allow us to. Another thing, the receiving method will, in the receiving method in the new interface controller is going to be looking for an any object optional to unwrap. Now, we can also segue to a page-based collection. The first thing we need to do here is connect up the pages to be displayed with next page segues. So we make these segues in the same way. We control, click, and drag, but here we're dragging from one interface controller to another. And then we select the next page type. It's the only type available to us for selection. But each page must be backed by a class. Now, they don't have to be backed by different classes, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We connect a button on the displaying controller that's going to display this collection of pages to the first page of the collection. We connect it with a modal segue. The question might be, can we push a page-based collection? Can we connect that with a push segue? No, we can't. It must be modal. We give the modal segue an identifier, and then in the displaying controller, we override contexts for segue with identifier, passing in the identifier string and returning an array of any object as an optional. The array of contexts will be mapped to the pages in the same order that the pages are in your Interface Builder storyboard. Now, that means that the number of contexts that you return in this array of any object must be the same as the number of interface controllers in your page-based collection. If they're off, you crash. That's bad. Don't do it. So a few notes. Context for segue with identifier works with either a push or a modal segue to one single WK interface controller. Contexts for segue with identifier works only with a modal segue and only to a page-based collection of controllers. Now, if we're segueing to a collection of pages using contexts for segue with identifier, and the pages are all identical except for content, in other words, except for their contexts, we can use a single interface controller class for all the pages. And we'll see this in WK Demo 4 when we show you how to segue to a page-based collection. Thank you very much.